question of EU reform has really been around ever since David Cameron's Bloomberg speech in January 2013, where he explicitly linked the question or the promise of a referendum, an in-out referendum, on a vote between an out and what he called a new settlement for Britain and Europe. This new settlement has yet to be found, has yet to be negotiated, has yet to be agreed, and this is really where our debate is coming in.
I do think Cameron can, if he's clever, get some fairly useful reforms to the EU and win a referendum. I think it's possible, but difficult.
It's interesting how EU reform already in this country means something completely else than you would assume it means in France, Germany, Italy, or in Poland.
So the idea that has been put forward by David Cameron, that we should have a sort of one-off reform to be defined this year, negotiated next year, ratified the year after, and then it's done forevermore, seems to me to be pretty preposterous.
The UK is asking basically for reform, which in my view, in the way that it's being discussed, can actually only take place through a treaty reform process.
What would actually be put on the table? That's not yet been defined in detail. Cameron identified 4 issues. First, he said we must address the issue of the preamble of the treaty that refers to ever closer union. Ever closer union is not for Britain. Now, this is a preambular declaration. It has no legal consequences. So why change that? Maximum effort, because it needs treaty change, for minimum effect. Second theme was that we need protection in the European Union from countries that are not members of the euro.
There isn't currently, I think, a problem of the Eurogroup caucusing, getting together, ganging up, imposing their wishes on the wider EU. They might do that one day, though. They will, in the long term, probably have more interest in common than they have today. There are risks there, and I think some sort of safeguards in the treaty, if there's treaty change, or outside the treaty if there's not, to say that the Eurogroup shouldn't intervene or gang up on areas that are not their own competence. Something along those lines probably would gather support from quite a lot of other countries.
The third thing he said was allow national parliaments to come together to veto EU legislation. What he means by coming together is to build on what's called in EU jargon the yellow card procedure. Any Commission proposal has to go first to national parliaments. They have 8 weeks to respond, but they have a special mechanism to say, hang on, we object to this, it's beyond the remit of the EU. In the 5.5 years of its existence, the yellow card has been triggered twice. In other words, national parliaments generally do not think there is a big problem of the Commission making proposals that are not within the remit of the EU.
You said that yellow card procedure has only been used twice. True, but of course that doesn't mean that there were only 2 occasions when national parliaments thought the Commission was breaching subsidiarity in coming forward with a proposal, because there is this thing called a reasoned opinion. A national parliament produces a reasoned opinion, and only if 1/3 of all the national parliaments, roughly, produce these reasons opinion, then the yellow card is exercised. And there have been dozens of occasions, Richard, as you know, when individual national parliaments, or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, have produced reasoned opinions. You don't have to change the treaties to improve this procedure. You could have an informal understanding that if enough national parliaments, we can argue about the number, if enough of them raise the yellow card, then the Commission would treat it as a red card and withdraw the proposal.
The national parliaments need to themselves become active, both individually and also more horizontally in partnership with other national parliaments, in order to hold their own executives to account, who after all are the participants to a very important degree in Brussels in terms of taking decisions. I'm talking about laws that require the government to provide certain information to Parliament.
And the fourth issue he raised was safeguards on migration. Interestingly, this was not mentioned in his Bloomberg speech 2 years ago. Most migrants in Britain are from outside the EU, which is entirely a matter for national regulation. Within the EU, we have an almost equal balance between the number of Brits in other EU countries and the number of people from other EU countries in Britain.
The other area we've discussed is migrants. A lot of the idea in Cameron's migration speech in November, although more moderate than the quotas, would still require treaty change, but he can do some of the things he asked without treaty change in terms of making people live here for longer before they get benefits and so on.
In terms of instruments, so how do you effectuate some of the ideas that are being discussed? I think that could be UK initiated, the government, where they think concretely in terms of a kind of generic opt-out from provisions of the existing treaties, so the existing status quo, also the acquis communautaire, and there is something like that already there is a precedent in the Treaty of Lisbon. I'm just saying in terms of institutional ways of doing it, but that would have to take place in the context of a full-blown treaty and would require the consent of the others.
The only kind of treaty change that could possibly happen is what you could call a post-dated check. So you could imagine a promise, a declaration saying, we really promise the British that we will make these particular changes to the treaties. Frankly, that's the best Cameron will do. There's no other sort of treaty change possible except for that, in my view.
But there are also other pathways to reform, as you also set up, that are more practice-based, if you like, and less treaty-focused.
If you want to reform the European Union, policy reform is much easier than treaty change. Treaty change needs every country to agree and unanimous ratification in every single one of the 28 member states.
The last 2 years, the line coming out of Downing Street has been, we will change the treaties because the euro is going to collapse without a massive transfer of powers to the centre. Therefore, there has to be a treaty change. Therefore, Britain has massive leverage because they'll need our signature on a new treaty. Well, of course, that's not true. No government wants a treaty change. I would have said a year ago, except for the Germans and the British. Not even the Germans now.
And also what has happened in recent years with the fiscal compact and other treaties is that simply when all don't agree, they simply go outside the context of the EU completely. So in that way, avoiding parliaments, courts and all the other irritants within the context of the EU.
Reform is something that is an ongoing process in the European Union. That's what the EU does day in, day out nowadays, year after year. Because most EU policy making nowadays is about reforming, revising, revisiting existing policies. Most legislative proposals made by the European Commission are about amending, updating, repealing, adjusting existing EU legislation. That's what we do day in, day out.
Whereas an awful lot of what the European Union does nowadays is not legislation. In fact, there's a shrinking of legislation. I don't know if you've seen those recent figures which shows that the number of regulations and directives have shrunk radically in recent years, and there's a rise of the non-legislative, of alternatives to legislation in all kinds of ways. This
is not something you do through treaty change, but just, the single market. I mentioned the digital single market. Services, a huge benefit to Britain if we can liberalise services across the EU. The French and the Germans are not very enthusiastic, but many countries are enthusiastic. Energy, the EU energy market is imperfect, but it's getting better all the time. For our own energy security, we need to strengthen that, build more interconnections. Another area, of course, is trade agreements. If we can make a success not only of TTIP, the EU-US trade agreement, but also other agreements in the pipeline with Japan, Southeast Asian countries, Latin Americans, and so on. That's good for Britain, and we won't get those agreements unless we're part of the EU.
And there are plenty of policies that need further reform or further deepening. The deepening of the single market in the digital and services sphere, for instance, making sure the rather substantial historic revision of the common fishing policy that was agreed in principle last year is actually implemented. EU reform is not a one-off event. And there are already signs that what the British government is proposing is beginning to annoy many of our neighbouring countries, our fellow members of the European Union.
The starting point is not good because the British brand is really toxic in Europe. People in this country don't know how other governments have been annoyed by Cameron's behaviour over the last 5 years.
The perception of the EU around the world, and curiously enough also of the euro, that this perception is primarily being shaped by either UK or US media. And not only do they shape the perception of the EU and the euro in Asia, Africa, the United States, the sheer scale and journalistic influence and quality of these news organizations then powerfully reverberates back into the national media of each EU member state.
If you want to reform the EU, you need friends and allies. How many allies did Cameron have when the vote on Juncker's appointment came? Hungary, one ally. This isn't just a criticism of Cameron's government. This is a long-running problem. Clubs have rules, but they have mores as well. And you're more influential if you follow the mores, if you're clubbable.
You won't necessarily get what you want. The UK won't necessarily. They're not in control of the process. They will have to negotiate. They will have to be allowed in, etc., etc.
Other countries actually want a Britain that is influential and takes the initiative where it has expertise in the single market and trade, in climate and energy, in foreign policy.
The method he's proposing amounts to 2 rounds of blackmail. Round 1, you say to other EU countries, change the EU in the way that I want, or we're off, and try and get concessions that he would otherwise not gain. If he succeeds in that, round 2 is to turn around to the British people and say, right, look, this is what I've negotiated. You have a choice between that or exit. So Cameron's Europe or no Europe. The status quo won't be on the ballot paper. A different set of reforms won't be on the ballot paper. It'll be this sort of Europe, the conservative Europe, Cameron's Europe, or nothing. And at that point, of course, he will say, don't even think of leaving. It would be economic suicide. It would be a national catastrophe. You better vote for what I've negotiated. You can see the problem, can't you?
And if he wants to convince his partners that he's serious about reforming the EU and keeping Britain in, and he does have a credibility problem, he's got to go out there on the stump, making speeches, annoying the Eurosceptics. And if he thinks he can leave that till the last week of the referendum campaign, it may be too late.
I would like to ask a question I really would like to understand better, because as I hopefully have made clear, I very much hope that the UK will stay in, but what will the European Union lose? I think that needs to be understood much more clearly. There's, of course, a symbolic damage, there's the narrative damage, there's the potential domino effect. But what will it lose structurally?
If Britain leaves, other countries could conceivably think about leaving. It'll obviously be bad for the Germans' point of view, for the overall economic balance in the European Union in terms of a pro-market country leaving. A lot of other countries would be worried about Germany becoming too dominant without the British there. It would affect justice and home affairs policies. It would weaken European foreign and defence policies. For all these reasons, I think most governments will want Britain to stay.
Do you see yourself as a citizen of the European Union, as an EU citizen? And the majority of European citizens, or technical European citizens, also perceive themselves as such. But if you conclude from the sentiment in the UK, you might misjudge what is actually happening in the EU. And this is one of the gambles I think Mr. Cameron is taking, that he concludes that there is far less appetite for more integration in Europe than there actually is. But I'm convinced that the UK itself will have a much better future if it not only stays in the EU, but acknowledges 2 things. That the EU has never been only about economics, and that this wonderful country which Europe owes so much to will itself have a safer, more prosperous, and I might add, also happier future than it would have as a loosely affiliated nation state.